Good afternoon to our listeners on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM, our viewers on the Parliament channel, and those of you joining us via the World Wide Web on the Parliament's website www.ttparliament.org. We're just a few moments away from the start of today's sitting of the Senate. On the agenda today, several papers to be laid, 3 urgent questions, 3 questions on notice, and debate is expected to begin in the Senate on the public procurement and disposal of public property bill. We take you over now to the chamber.
The Honourable the President.
We welcome you to the 20th sitting of the Senate in the first session of the 11th Parliament. It takes place on Tuesday, June 7th, 2016.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth, and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Announcements by the President.
Honourable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator the Honourable Jennifer Batiste Primus, Senator Dr. Lester Henry, and Senator Gerard Hadid, who are all out of the country, and to Senators Paul Richards and H.R. Ian Roach, who are both ill. Honourable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from His Excellency the President Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, SCORTT. To Mr. Rohan Sinanan. Whereas Senator the Honourable Jennifer Batiste Primus, the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, appointment of a temporary senator by His Excellency Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTTSC, President and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. To Mr. Rohan Sinanan. Whereas Senator the Honourable Jennifer Batiste Primus is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of her absence from Trinidad and Tobago. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, do hereby appoint you, Rohan Sinanan, to be temporarily a member of the Senate, with effect from the 7th of June 2016, and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator Batiste Primus. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President, St. Anne's, this 6th day of June 2016. To Mr. Ronald Huggins. Whereas Senator Dr. Lester Henry is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his absence from Trinidad and Tobago. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, do hereby appoint you, Ronald Huggins, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 7th of June 2016 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator Dr. Lester Henry, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, this 6th day of June 2016. To Pastor Clive Dottin. Whereas Senator Paul Richards is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his illness. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Pastor Clive Dottin, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 7th of June 2016 and continuing during the absence of Senator Paul Richards by reason of illness, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, this 7th day of June 2016. Honourable Senators, we are to receive 2 further instruments of appointment, so later on in the proceedings we will have the swearing of those 2 senators. Honourable Senators, senators are required to take the oath. Please stand.
I, Rohan Sananan, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by the Bhagavad Gita that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibility to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, Ronald Huggins, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, Clive Dottin, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Honourable Senators, as you are aware, former Senator Clive Spencer passed away on June the 2nd, 2016. I now invite you to offer your tributes. Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. On behalf of the Government of Trinidad and Tobago and on this bench, I want to pay tribute to the passing of former Independent Senator Clive Randolph Winston Spencer, born August 10, 1936. I see from the records here that he was appointed a senator, an independent senator, in 1966. In those days, at a very tender age of 30. So while it is the trend now to appoint fairly young senators, in the 1960s, that was not the case. So in that sense, obviously, he had something special about him. I don't know the gentleman personally, so I cannot speak in that capacity. But what I have noticed, Madam President, is that we are fast losing an entire generation of our immediate post-independence leaders. These were gentlemen of stature and women of stature. This was the era when country was put before self, and in a very, very serious way. I think we have lost our morals as a nation when it comes to that, and there's a lot we can learn if we study the lives and accomplishment of the people who led this country during the 60s and 70s. From the records, I see here that he spanned the entire spectrum of the Port Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, another unique accomplishment of this distinguished gentleman. Madam President, he was President General of the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Trade Union from 1965 to 1970. He was also President of the Trinidad and Tobago Labour Congress, now defunct. Follow his career carefully. He became General Manager and Chief Executive Officer of the Port Authority of Trinidad and Tobago from 1992 to 1997. And then he went on to become the Chairman of the Port Authority in the year 2011. So in a seamless transition, he moved from President General of the Cement and Waterfront Workers Trade Union and President of the Trinidad and Tobago Labour Congress to Chief Executive Officer of the Port Authority, and then onwards to Chairman of the Port Authority in a seamless transition from labor to management to board. I hope I don't get in problems of saying this, but the situation you see now is where a labor representative seems to be a career position. And what we want to see is that you can come from labor, you can come from the bowels of labor, go on to management, because if you love the institution in which you work for, there is nothing wrong in moving from the labor movement into senior management. Senator Spencer accomplished a lot. He was very instrumental in establishing the system of national awards in Trinidad, Prime Minister's export promotion. He was also instrumental in forming the National Insurance Scheme in Trinidad and Tobago, and also the Workers' Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. Not very well known in the national community as we speak, but obviously a man of distinction, a man who has served this country extremely well. On behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, on behalf of my party, the People's National Movement, we want to offer our deepest condolences to his family and to hope and to pray that his soul rests in eternal peace. I thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam President. On behalf of the Senate Opposition Bench, I rise to pay tribute to former Independent Senator Mr. Clive Winston Spencer, who passed on June the 2nd, 2016. Mr. Spencer was born on August 10th, 1936, and served in the Senate from November the 19th, 1966 to October the 1st, 1970. During his tenure as an independent senator, Mr. Clive Spencer was the youngest member in the Senate, and his youthful exuberance in contributing to the development of the nation can be seen by his active participation in debates and the Regulations Committee. Mr. Spencer came from a family aligned to serving people, as his father was a public officer in the Postal Service and his mother a seamstress. And so he continued in this mold during his professional career. Mr. Spencer served on such an extensive list of committees, clubs, and associations in his professional career that if I were to attempt to name them all, my tribute will never end today. Most notably, Madam President, he was the President General of that very powerful trade union, the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Trade Union, President of the Trinidad and Tobago Labour Congress, Chairman of the Committee for the Establishment of the Workers' Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, General Manager and Chief Executive Officer of the Port Authority between 1992 and 1997. And as my colleague said, he was also Chairman of the Port Authority of TNT in 2011, or from 2011. During his period of service at the Port Authority, it was noted that Mr. Spencer was dedicated to his job around the clock. This resulted in productivity increasing tremendously, and the port being developed during his period of service than any other. Mr. Spencer was also a man of the people and involved workers in the decision-making process. Clive Spencer's service to the trade union movement was nationally recognized early in his career, as he was awarded, Madam President, the Shakonia Medal Silver in 1970. Clive Spencer was fearless, motivated, honest, independent, and extremely hardworking. He was an individual who led from the front and was never arrogant in dealing with people. In their time of grief, I would like to express on behalf of the opposition bench our sincere condolences to his wife, his 3 offsprings, Leslie, Annalisa, and Clive, his brother, Mr. Trevor Spencer, and his grandchild. The nation as a whole owes a debt of gratitude to Mr. Spencer for his invaluable contribution to the development of our nation during the period that he commanded space on this earth. May the Lord of the universe richly bless him, even in death, and may his soul rest in peace.
Senator Mahabir.
Thank you very much, Madam President. On behalf of the independent bench of the Parliament, I too would like to pay tribute to our former independent senator, Senator Clive Spencer. Senator Spencer would have entered this Parliament 1966, appointed by then Governor General Sir Solomon Huchoy, a full decade before we achieved Republican status. At the age of 30, Madam President, he would have distinguished himself in such a manner that he would have been asked to serve on the independent bench of our Parliament. And when one looks at his record, one sees a continuing theme of the service that he offered to the country through the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. Examining his professional career, I saw that he was on the committee which contemplated the introduction of the National Insurance Board of Trinidad and Tobago. We now take it for granted that we are entitled to some NIS payments when we have made a certain 750 contributions. But prior to the establishment of the NIB in the early 70s, you would have had background work pioneered by people like Clive Spencer and others, but certainly Senator Spencer in establishing the National Insurance Board. Mr. Spencer also, on behalf of the working class of Trinidad and Tobago, sat on the committee to establish the Workers' Bank of Trinidad and Tobago so that the working class of this country can obtain for themselves a certain amount of savings, not only at pensions for NIB, but also during their working career, they would have been able to access loans at a working bank and at the Workers' Bank, and also to be able to accumulate their own capital. Our colleague, Clive Spencer, was an active trade unionist. He worked on the Tripartite Committee on Vocational Training. He also sat on a committee for the establishment of the Cipriani Labour College, and also on the committee for the establishment of national awards. These are institutions, Madam President, which now form part of the landscape of Trinidad and Tobago. As citizens of the Republic, we all benefit from the work all of these committees do. We benefit from the organizations that former Senator Spencer assisted in building. These are the institutions which are now critical for improving the quality of life of people in this country who, before the organizations were established, did not have the mechanism to improve their own welfare. And when one examines the list of committees on which he sat in the Parliament, one saw that there was indeed a tremendous amount of respect by the government of the day, the Williams administration, for the abilities and the commitment of Senator Spencer to the national good. And the record he has left is an indication to all of us in this independent bench that the independent senators of the past can provide for us and will continue to provide inspiration for us in the type of service we can perform for and on behalf of the people of the Republic. For this bench, we have lost a pioneer. We have lost someone who has established a noble and distinguished tradition in public service. We applaud his contribution to the national community. We applaud his contribution to the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, and we mourn his loss as members of the independent bench. To his family, Madam President, I say deepest condolences, and to those immediate relatives closest to him who would feel the pain the greatest, I say the pain is personal, but really the loss is a loss to the country, and we express deepest sympathies and condolences, but let us celebrate his life. It was indeed a very distinguished career. I thank you, Madam President.
Honourable Senators, permit me to endorse all that has just been said about former Senator Clive Winston Spencer. As we have heard, he served in the second independent Parliament between 1966 to 1971. That, Honourable Senators, was a period of change and challenge for our country and our fledgling democracy. It was a time when, as a people, we had to steer our way safely through new waters. Former Senator Spencer, therefore, was one of those who helped lay down the anchor of our democratic principles, practices, and conventions. We are grateful for his service. Honourable Senators, I will instruct the clerk to convey to his beloved family your deep condolences and our kind sentiments. Honourable Senators, we may now stand and observe a minute's silence. Please be seated.
Papers.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper and supplemental order paper in my name. The report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Penal DB Regional Corporation for the year ended September 30th, 2005. The report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Chaguanas Borough Corporation for the year ended September 30th, 2010. The second report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Diego Martin Regional Corporation for the year ended September 30th, 2003. The reports of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Diego Martin Regional Corporation for the years ended September 30th, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, and 2008. The annual audited financial statements of the Telecommunications Services of Trinidad and Tobago Limited for the financial years ended March 31st, 2013, 2014, and 2015. The annual audited financial statements of Caroni 1975 Limited for the years ended June 30th, 2014 and 2015. The annual report of the Securities and Exchange Commission for the year ended 2015.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in the names of the Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs and the Minister of Community Development, Culture and the Arts. The annual administrative report of the Sports Company of Trinidad and Tobago, SPORTT, for the periods October 2012 to September 2013 and October 2013 to September 2014. The administrative report of the National Commission for Self-Help Limited for the period October 2014 to September 2015.
Urgent questions.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Honourable Minister of Finance, with regard to the government's withdrawal of $2.5 billion from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, can the Minister state the reasons for the withdrawal and the immediate measures to be taken to replenish these funds?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. financing of the service of Trinidad and Tobago for the year 2016.
Minister, repeat the answer, please. Yes, it was very short, so repeat it, please.
This is a new thing. Financing of the service of Trinidad and Tobago for the year 2016.
Madam President, could the Honorable Minister of Finance provide this Honorable Senate with a detailed breakdown of that financing mechanism for the service of Trinidad and Tobago?
I can't see how that flows from the question. The question was, what is the reason? And the reason is to finance the service of Trinidad and Tobago for this fiscal year.
Madam President, did I ask the Honorable Minister to indicate to this Honorable Senate how he intends to replenish the funds that he has withdrawn from the people's savings?
Minister of Finance.
Certainly. As the Honourable Senator will know, the deposits into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund are made by way of a statutory instrument which is called the Heritage and Stabilization Fund Act of Trinidad and Tobago. And in every fiscal year, an estimate is made of the revenues from petroleum for that fiscal year based on the estimates for the price of the basket of crudes in Trinidad and Tobago and the price of natural gas obtained for our natural gas produced in Trinidad and Tobago, used both here and exported in the form of liquefied natural gas. And if the actual revenues from petroleum exceed the estimates, then 60% of the surplus is deposited into the fund and 40% can be retained for government expenditure. Therefore, in order to replenish any funds withdrawn from the stabilization fund, we would have to have an excess of petroleum revenues exceeding the estimates of revenue from petroleum for the fiscal year.
Senator Mark.
To the Honorable Minister of National Security, given the recent removal of a set of keys from the Port of Spain prison, can the Minister state what measures are being taken to prevent a recurrence of such a situation?
Honorable Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In light of the recent removal of keys from the Port of Spain prison, the following enhanced and robust measures have already been implemented to avoid such reoccurrence. These strengthened measures include the following: effective monitoring and full compliance of the proper handling of keys, and in fact handing over of keys to only senior officers of the rank of Prison Officer 2 and above. Efficient mastering of all cell gates at night, enhanced security of all lockdown areas, ensuring that the handover of keys is undertaken by senior officers with proper scrutiny and revised methods of checking. Only the supervisor will handle the master key for all cell gates. The Commissioner of Prisons has in fact appointed Acting Assistant Commissioner of Prison, Mr. Dennis Pulchan, to inquire into the full circumstances concerning this matter, with a mandate to review the processes and to make recommendations for the improvement. Madam President.
Madam President, could the Honorable Minister of National Security tell the Senate whether protocols were in place at the prisons to avoid such an incident that occurred recently?
Madam President, there are prison regulations which speaks to the handling of keys within the prisons.
Madam President, is the Minister indicating that those regulations that deals with the handling of keys were violated by the prison's authorities that resulted in this incident and embarrassment to national security?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, there's an ongoing investigation to determine the circumstances under which the keys were removed from the prison.
Senator Mark.
Finishing too early?
Next question, Senator
Yes, Madam. To the Honourable Minister of National Security, given the discovery earlier today of a grenade near a school in your constituency of Point Fortin, what immediate measures are being taken to protect the citizens of such dangerous devices?
Madam President, Madam President, I first put on the records that the alleged device that was found at a school near Point Fortin, in fact it was about a quarter mile away from the Point Fortin RC school, based on information from the Commissioner of Police, was in fact a hoax. It was not a real device. It turned out to be a cigarette lighter in the shape of a hand grenade, Madam President. Madam President, but I also want to take this opportunity to compliment the resident of Point Fortin for his, what I call, patriotism, for understanding and taking the message that we have been sending from the Ministry of National Security. If you see it, report it. So I want to compliment that citizen, that resident of Point Fortin, for in fact reporting what he thought or he believed to be a device, Madam President.
Your constituent.
I want to also assure the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago that the security forces are doing all that is required to prevent, one, hand grenades and other illicit weapons and arms and ammunition from coming into Trinidad and Tobago. But we also ask the citizens to follow from this example, that if you see it, report it, because we depend on every citizen to contribute or to participate in security measures in Trinidad and Tobago, Madam President.
Madam President, whilst this one might have been a hoax, the question here is what steps are you taking as the Minister of National Security to ensure that grenades do not enter this country and end up in the hands of the wrong persons?
Mark. Oh, that as a supplemental question.
I don't is muttering about. You are in charge.
Senator Mark, any further supplementals?
Would you leave? I will rest.
Questions on notice?
Senator Mark. Oh, Leader of Government
Yeah.
Business.
Madam President, I crave your indulgence to indicate that the government is seeking a deferral of question number 57 for 2 weeks, and we will be answering. No. Yeah. Oh, sorry. We'll be answering all questions today.
Oh, yeah. Very good. Senator Mark.
I'm so happy that you are in charge. Question number 57 rather, to the Prime Minister.
With your leave, Madam President, the answer to question number 57 respectfully is no.
Madam President, is the Honourable Minister saying that the criticism levelled against the Integrity Commission by the Prime Minister was reckless and irresponsible?
That does not fall as a supplemental question.
Oh, that is not a supplemental. Could the Honourable Prime Minister indicate when the government intends to take measures, that is the Office of the Prime Minister, to revise the Integrity in Public Life Act?
But Senator Mark, that was the question posed and the Minister answered. Senator Mark.
Question number 58 to the Honourable Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Honourable members, there are several pieces of legislation which provide compensation for members of the protected services who were killed in the line of duty. These include, but are not limited to, the Criminal Injuries Compensation Act, Chapter 531, and the Protective Services Compensation Act, Chapter 2360. The Criminal Injuries Compensation Act provides general compensation for victims who suffer criminal injuries or are killed by criminal acts or omissions of other persons. These victims include protective services personnel. The maximum compensation amount payable under this act is $25,000, which may, by the order of the Minister of National Security, be increased to up to $50,000. The Protective Services Compensation Act, however, has specific provisions for police officers, fire officers, and prison officers. Section 3 of the Act states that where an officer suffers personal injury, dies instantly, or dies as a result of personal injury sustained in circumstances arising out of and in the course of his employment with the state shall be liable to pay compensation in accordance with this Act. Further, subsection A, Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 of the second schedule states that compensation for death arising out of and in the course of employment will equate to an amount equal to 3 years' gross salary at the date of death. And such entitlement, as is provided under the Police Service Act, the Fire Service Act, the Prison Service Act, and the Pensions Act, or any other relevant legislation. Members should also be aware that in addition to the Protective Services Compensation Act, other benefits and or pensions to widows and or dependents of officers who perish in the course of duties are outlined in Section 76, the Police Service Act, Chapter 1501, Section 9 of the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550, and Section 11 of the Prison Service Act, Chapter 1302. It is clear, therefore, that several avenues already exist through the families of officers in our protective services who died in line of duty receive compensation. The Minister of National Security held a general meeting with representatives of the Police Service Social and Welfare Association, the Prison Officers Association, and the Fire Service Association, at which the matter regarding compensation to the families of officers killed in the line of duty was raised. In September 2014, Madam President, in the budget statement of that year, the previous Minister of Finance, Senator Larry Hawaii, made a public pronouncement on the payment of the Trinidad and Tobago $1 million compensation to members of the Defense Force and Protective Services who were killed in the performance of their duties. This, however, Madam President, was not followed up with an implementation plan. In other words, Madam President, the necessary administrative work was not done to allow payment to be made. For example, there was no definition of the phrase "in the line of duty." There was no definition with respect to the next of kin, nor were there any systems to determine who is the beneficiary to receive the compensation. This government, Madam President, which recognizes the sacrifices of members of the services, are called to make, that members of the services are called to make in the performance of their duties, is committed to putting the necessary mechanism in place to pay the compensation to affected members of the services, Madam President.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister of National Security tell the Senate what steps have been taken to establish the implementation plan that you referred to a short while ago? And when will it be effected and operationalized?
Madam President, the matter is currently before the Cabinet, and it is intended to deal with this matter in the shortest possible time, in fact, by the end of June 2016, Madam President.
Madam President, through you, could the Honourable Minister of National Security give this Senate the undertaking that by June the 30th, 2016, this particular matter that has been outstanding will be completed, will be effected, and the families of those officers who have died in the line of duty will receive their $1 million compensation. Could the Honorable Minister give this undertaking to this Honorable House?
I won't allow that as a supplemental. I listened to what the Minister said in his response, and what you're asking now doesn't really come from that, to ask for an undertaking. So no, I won't allow that.
Well, Madam President, I'm asking the Honorable Minister whether at the end of June of 2016, the implementation plan that he mentioned to effect the changes of $1 million will be effected properly and efficiently. That is a question I'm putting to the Honorable Minister.
Honorable Minister.
Madam President, the implementation plan that the last government failed to do, and simply making an announcement, will be treated with based on the cabinet decision as early as the end of June, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
You spoke to me?
Senator Mark.
No, I thought she was muttering. Okay.
And you, Senator.
Through you, Madam President, question number 59 to the Honorable Minister of National Security.
Honorable Minister of National Security.
Thank you, Madam President. Honorable members, as Minister of National Security, I am deeply concerned about the crime rate facing this country, and in particular, the current murder rate. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate the fact that crime is everybody's business, and that each citizen has a role to play in reducing the crime rate in this country. The fact is that previous administrations have all struggled to keep the crime rate under control. It is imperative that all citizens be the eyes and ears of the law enforcement authorities so that preemptive actions can be taken. We must all be vigilant and work alongside the law enforcement agencies to arrest this scourge on our society. The law enforcement agencies cannot do it alone, Madam President. The Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, which is the state's primary agency responsible for law enforcement, has put several measures in place to deal with the current murder rate in this country. These include, and not limited to, an intensified drive to remove illegal firearms and ammunition throughout the country. In Trinidad and Tobago, approximately 80% of the murders are committed with the use of firearms. And it is common knowledge that arms and ammunition are not manufactured in this country, but along with narcotics, enter our shores through legal ports of entry, primarily in the southern areas. In 2010, the previous administration blocked the purchase of critical naval assets, which were procured to secure the nation's borders. Since then, Madam President, the country has been reeling under the scourge of illegal arms and ammunition. Over the last 5 years, approximately 2,000 firearms and 30,000 rounds of ammunition were seized. During the period January to March this year, Trinidad and Tobago Police took a total of 229 firearms, 2,600 rounds of ammunition off the street. The Trinidad and Tobago Police Service has also implemented more extensive patrols along the coastal areas together with the Defense Force in divisions where there is a high probability for the implementation or the importation of illegal arms and ammunition. The Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner of Police are now providing direct additional support to areas that have been highlighted, such as the southern divisions and the northern divisions, which has high levels of murders. Collaboration between the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and other law enforcement agencies has been strengthened to foster a more integrated approach in intelligence gathering and sharing. These agencies include the Strategic Services Agency, Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, the Customs and Excise Division, the Port Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, Trinidad and Tobago Immigration Division, and Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service. There has also been increased collaborations with communities throughout town meetings. The idea behind these meetings is to facilitate greater dialogue between the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and the public. There has been collaboration with the residents where persons can raise their concerns openly with police officers with respect to safety and security concerns. Such engagements allowed for an exchange of ideas and engender a greater sense of trust in the police service by members of the public. There is also an increase in people-centered foot and mobile patrols throughout the country, which has been intensified in areas considered to be hotspots. In addition to these measures, Madam President, there are other measures implemented at Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. The Ministry of National Security has implemented several other measures to address the current crime situations. These include the following: the restructuring of the Strategic Services Agency, which now includes the National Operations Center and the National Security Training Institute. Intelligence gathering is a critical component in the national security apparatus of any country in the fight against crime. The reconfiguration of this important intelligence agency will facilitate enhanced intelligence gathering and dissemination to the relevant national security agencies for operations. There has also been a major increase in the number of CCTV cameras installed. In December 2015, the Ministry of National Security operationalized 800 additional closed-circuit televisions across the country. Closed-circuit television cameras, Madam President, across the country. The total number of CCTV cameras in operation now stands at 1,800. It is emphasized that the installation of these cameras will not only act as a deterrent to the commission of crime, but also provide vital information that will assist in boosting the detection rate. Another measure, Madam President, is that the process of the appointment, the Commissioner of Police, has been initiated in accordance with Legal Notice number 218 and 219. It is anticipated that this appointment will have a positive impact on the morale of members of the police service and ultimately on the crime-fighting efforts. It is envisaged, Madam President, that the various measures outlined would be instrumental in stemming the amount of serious crime, and in particular, the current murder rate which now confronts the country. However, it is equally important for all citizens to work together with the law enforcement agencies to ensure a safer country for all of us, Madam President.
Madam President, may I ask the Honourable Minister on the issue of collaboration, not only at the community level, but in an effort to stem the flow of weapons into Trinidad and Tobago, since we do not manufacture those weapons. Could you share with the Senate what measures are being taken between Venezuela and the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago through their respective ministers of national securities to stem the flow of illegal weapons, arms and ammunition, and other dangerous weapons into our country? Through you, Madam President.
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, I wish to assure this House and the members of the public that we continue to engage the authorities in Venezuela with respect to collaboration and cooperation to deal with issues that confront us on both sides of our borders, especially with respect to the illegal movements and trafficking of arms, ammunition, and of course the movement of people. As to spell out the detail as to what measures would in fact put for security, our security measures open to the public, and I wish not to do so at this point in time, Madam President.
Madam President, may I ask the Honourable Minister, I don't know if it slipped him or if I missed it, but are there regular army and police patrols throughout the country, given your outline of the measures that you have taken to stem the tide, the rising tide of criminality and violence? And are you satisfied that the joint patrols are having the kind of efficacy on the objectives that you are seeking to accomplish?
Minister of National Security.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, there continues to be joint army and police patrols, both within the domestic environments, but also along our coastal areas. There's a combination of not only our joint police and army patrols, but in fact, also in our maritime security environment, where the Coast Guard also play a presence. These patrols will continue because there is a need for both the military, the defense force, and the police to work collaboratively and cooperatively to ensure that we deal with the security issues that confront us. With respect to the question if I'm satisfied, there's always room for improvement, Madam President, and therefore we continue to see where the gaps are, to see where the deficiencies are, and build and strengthen the capacities where they're required, Madam President.
Madam President, Central Trinidad has now become a hotspot for criminal activities and violence. Could the Honourable Minister indicate to this Senate what steps he has taken to address the rise in criminality and violence in Central Trinidad, particularly through the avenue of joint patrols, army and police?
I do not know how many times I have to remind members about turning off your cellular phones. Minister of National Security.
Madam President. Madam President, Central Division, like all other divisions in Trinidad and Tobago, are the focus of all joint army patrols and Trinidad and Tobago police measures to deal with the issue of crime and criminality. So that there will continue to be vigilant, there will continue to be measures adopted by the security forces in dealing with issues throughout Trinidad and Tobago. The needs of any one area is based on the situation, and the security forces will respond accordingly, Madam President.
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on definite matters of urgent public importance.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 16, I seek your leave to move the adjournment of the Senate for the purpose of discussing a definite matter or a definite matter of urgent public importance. That is the decision by the government to withdraw approximately $2.5 billion from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. The matter is definite as it refers to the withdrawal of money from the fund established in law to save and invest any surplus of petroleum revenues. The matter is urgent because the issue was only made public in the Prime Minister's confirmation of the withdrawal from the fund via the media on June the 5th, 2016. The matter is of public importance because of the failure of the government to detail its decision to the public prior to the Prime Minister's confirmation. The need for the public to be informed of the proposed uses for the money withdrawn. And finally, Madam President, the rational expectation that the money be used to safeguard a heritage for future generations during the current period of revenue downturn. I thank you, Madam President.
Honourable Senators, I'm not satisfied that this matter qualifies under this standing order. I do wish to point out that an urgent question on this issue was allowed and raised earlier in the proceedings.
Public business, government business, bills, second reading.
Honourable Senators, before we move on to public business, I did indicate that we were awaiting 2 instruments of appointment, so that I am now in receipt of those instruments and we will proceed accordingly. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago by His Excellency Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTTSC, President and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. To Mr. Wayne Anthony Munro. Whereas Senator Gerard Hadid is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his absence from Trinidad and Tobago. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(b) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Wayne Anthony Munro, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 3rd of June 2016 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator Gerard Hadid. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President, St. Anne's, this 7th day of June 2016. To Mr. Albert William Benedict Sidney. Whereas Senator Hugh Russell Ian Roach is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his illness. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President has aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Albert William Benedict Sidney, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 7th of June 2016 and continuing during the absence of Senator Hugh Russell Ian Roach by reason of his illness. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, this 7th day of June 2016. Honorable Senators are about to take the oath, so can we please stand?
I, Wayne Monroe, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, solemnly affirm that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibility to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, upon which I am about to enter.
I, Albert William Benedict Sidney, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Government Business Bill, second reading.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Public Procurement and Disposal of Property Act 2015 be now read a second time. Madam President, the bill before the House was the subject of the deliberations of a joint select committee of Parliament. The committee comprised myself as chairman, Ms. Sherian Critchlow-Coburn, Mr. Adrian Leonce, Dr. Bowinder Dradat Tiwari, Mr. Franklin Khan, Mrs. Paula Gopi-School, Mr. Wayne Sturge, and Mr. David Small. We had 5 meetings between December 2015 and February 2016, and the report of the committee, which includes amendments to the bill was laid in the Parliament shortly thereafter. Most members of the committee had the time to attend meetings. Mr. Can attended all but one. He was excused. Mrs. Gopi Schoon attended all 5 meetings. Mr. Sturge missed all 5 meetings. He was absent, I know. He was absent with excuses on all 5 occasions. Mr. Small was present at all meetings. I was present, obviously. Ms. Coburn missed 1, Mr. Leonce was present at all, and Dr. Tawari missed 2 with excuses. So the majority of members were there for all of the meetings or most of the meetings. We had very frank and fruitful discussions, and we went through the various clauses in the legislation. If I go to the legislation itself, and I presume, Madam President, I'm dealing with the bill that came from the House, but I would have to give some history on what happened to the original bill. Now, the original bill had not many clauses, had 7 clauses, and in the original bill, Clause 3 dealt with a procedure to remove the regulator, the procurement regulator, from office if he traded with the government without approval of the Parliament. The second clause in the original bill was that the reports of the procurement regulator would be sent to the Public Accounts Committee. The fifth clause was to tidy up a matter dealing with the suspension of procurement proceedings after a decision made by the Office of the Procurement Regulator. The sixth clause sought to establish a Public Procurement Review Board as an intermediate, non-judicial tribunal before aggrieved parties found themselves in litigation before the High Court. And the seventh clause included for the first time the disposal of state lands within the ambit of the Office of the Procurement Regulator. Now, Madam President, the Act, the Parent Act, Act number 1 of 2015, an act to provide for public procurement and for the retention and disposal of public property, was assented to on the 14th of January 2015. This was under the former administration. It was passed with a 3/5 majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, because it was felt that certain provisions of the Act were inconsistent with sections 4 and 5 of the Constitution dealing with fundamental rights. And this Act had a long history. It started off, in its original form, it was, I think they call them documents, legal legislative documents, were laid in the other place shortly after the May 2010 general election. A committee of both houses was appointed under the chairmanship of Dr. Gopi Singh. That committee functioned for approximately 1 year, was not able to complete its work, and then lapsed, and subsequently another committee was appointed under the chairmanship of Dr. Tewari, and eventually, after a lot of work, the Act number 1 of 2015 was presented to the Parliament and passed by both houses by a special majority. However, during that entire process, we, on this side, we were in the opposition then, were of the view that there were certain aspects of the legislation that needed to be dealt with in order to make it effective. And I would start with the last section first, and that is the disposal of state lands. And in the original legislation, or in the Act as it now stands, the Act was silent on the disposal of state lands and the disposal of property owned by the government or state enterprises or statutory authorities. At the time, there was a huge controversy. It has become somewhat muted now because the persons involved in that controversy now find themselves in the opposition over the disposal of the lands at Invaders Bay. There was a huge controversy over this project of the previous government, where there was a belief that the Ministry of Planning and Development and the Minister of Planning and Development of the time, I think he was called Economic Development, if I'm not wrong, but that was Dr. Tewari. There was a belief, widely held belief, among the population, among the interest groups such as the Joint Consultative Council and other persons involved in procurement and disposal of property, that the Central Tenders Board Act had been breached by the attempts of the then government to dispose of the lands at Invaders Bay without following the required procedures outlined in the Central Tenders Board Act. What had happened is that the Ministry of Planning had, on its own, of its own volition, proceeded to attempt to dispose of these lands, and had argued at the time, the then Minister of Planning at the time had argued that leasing of state lands is not disposal of state lands. We did not agree. I don't think anybody in Trinidad and Tobago agreed. In fact, I think the only person who agreed was the former Minister of Planning, that leasing of state lands is not disposal of state lands. We certainly did not agree with that. The JCC did not agree, and a member of the JCC took it to court. That is Mr. Raymond. And that matter is still in court. And it falls to us now, the PNM government, to deal with that court matter. And Mr. Young, I'm sure, will give us an update if he's so minded on this matter. But the bottom line is that there was a view, and we hold this view, that it was ultra-virus and illegal of the then Minister of Planning to attempt to dispose of the Invaders Bay lands. So it became an argument in the context of the public procurement and disposal of public property bill. It became a contentious and argumentative point in the deliberations of the Joint Select Committee, whether the disposal of state lands, the disposal of public property, should be under the remit of the Office of the Procurement Regulator. We felt it should. The former government did not. In fact, they were so adamant in it that when the bill came for the final debate, after it had gone through all the stages and the deliberations and the various committees and so on, and it came to the Parliament for final debate, the minister said he's entertaining no amendments. And it's true, he didn't entertain any. So that at the time we submitted an amendment that would allow state lands and public property, real property owned by the government and by state-controlled enterprises, statutory authorities, responsible to a minister, that these lands would come within the ambit of the public procurement and disposal of public property legislation, and we have put that into this amendment bill, and it is now here in clause 57A of the, will be 57A of the Act. So this is a new clause that is going to be added to the Public Procurement Act, and it reads as follows: notwithstanding the State Lands Act and any other written law to the contrary, the Minister may make regulations in respect of the disposal of state lands, real property owned by the government, real property owned by state-controlled enterprises, real property owned by a statutory body, responsibility for which is assigned to a Minister of Government. And we did it in this way because there would be certain state lands that are disposed of under other regulations, like agricultural land, for example. The Commissioner of State Lands would give leases according to a prescribed procedure prescribed in the State Lands Act with respect to disposal of lands for agricultural purposes and so on. So what we were trying to capture and what we will capture are the lands like the lands at Invaders Bay and so on that don't fall within any existing legislation and therefore would allow a minister to escape the framework of any existing law and dispose of state land, whether by lease or by sale, to the private sector. So we've put it in this way so that henceforth, once this legislation is approved by this Honorable Senate, that state lands, real property owned by the government, state enterprises or statutory authorities will now fall within the ambit of the Office of the Procurement Regulator, so that there will be proper oversight and no giveaways of state lands or irregularities in the disposal of state lands. So that's one of the first changes that we sought to make to the Act. We think this is very important. With respect to another change, I'll deal with the review board last. Let me go to the other changes. The Act was silent on what happens to the reports of the procurement regulator when they are laid on the table in Parliament. And we felt it should not be silent. It should be a statement, it should be a statutory requirement, so that what we have done is that we, in the amendment bill, we have stated at clause 4 actually, which amends section 24 of the Parent Act, that section 24(4) of the Act is amended by inserting after the word respectively, in the second place where it occurs, the words, and the report shall be referred forthwith to the Public Accounts Committee. And that's a select committee comprising members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, chaired by a member of the opposition, so that matters now that relate to government procurement will be referred to the Public Accounts Committee for them to examine and to deal with. The tidying up I spoke about is with respect to suspension of proceedings. Under the existing law, there is a power of the regulator to suspend procurement proceedings, and we found the Act is a bit untidy as to what happens after the procurement regulator has made a decision. We found that it was not sufficiently tight, so we felt we needed to tighten it up, and we put in this amendment bill, it deals with section 50 of the Parent Act, and we've added in a section that after the decision is rendered by the procurement regulator under subsection 11 of section 50, that the suspension of proceedings under subsection 4A, well, that's the operative section that allows the regulator to suspend procurement proceedings if he or she finds that something is wrong, shall be lifted immediately upon the issuance of the decision of the office under subsection 11. So we just wanted to make that clear, that if a decision is made, the suspension is lifted. That does not mean to say that the decision would not be against
the procurement. It could be that the regulator may make a decision to quash a procurement proceeding, or they may decide to approve it and then the suspension is automatically lifted. So that's just a tidying up clause. With respect to the last item, no, there was an item before where we found that the wording was a bit convoluted or a bit complicated, where if the regulator traded with the government, we felt that that would be a serious breach, and trading with the government is defined to mean, and we've extended it also beyond the actual regulator himself or herself, to all members of the procurement board or the office of the procurement regulator, everybody, that a member trades with the government if, while holding office, he becomes a party to or is a partner in a firm or a director or manager of a company which, to his knowledge, becomes a party to any contract with the government for or on behalf of the public service. And we felt this was so important that if the procurement regulator or member of the procurement board entered into a contract with any government department to do anything, to provide goods and services, we felt there was sufficient reason for them to be removed, because it would make it totally complicated. Even if they disclosed their interest and they didn't participate in decision making, we felt it was just too complicated. So that we felt that if somebody wants to participate in trading with the government, if they have a business, they want to sell services or goods to the government, but they also want to be a member of this procurement entity, that they would have to get prior approval of the Minister of Finance. So they would have to apply to the Minister of Finance for permission to trade with the government and also be a member of the procurement regulatory body. And of course, the minister would look at the circumstances, look and see whether there's a danger of a conflict of interest or any kind of bias, whether it's apparent or potential bias could arise, and make a decision as to whether the person will be allowed to enter into a contract with a government entity or not. And of course, if the answer is no, then that person will not be eligible to be a member of the procurement entity. And if they did not disclose this and they went ahead and they entered into a contract with a state entity while being a member of the procurement entity, we felt that that was sufficient reason to fire them, to get rid of them. So we've added that in because these things can happen in Trinidad and Tobago. It's commonplace. And you have so many arguments about whether the person has disclosed their interests, whether the person has recused themselves, whether they should recuse themselves. So we felt this is so important that they need to get permission first. And if they don't get it, they're gone. Okay, so that's another what we call improvement to the legislation that we came up with. And the final improvement, and this is based on experience, where procurement is such a contentious matter, and it is so complicated that public procurement could be stalled for years if it reaches the High Court. And I'll give a particular example. In 2000 or 2001, I can't recall the exact year, but I know it was under the Pandey administration. The then Minister of Infrastructure, I believe he was, or Housing, I'm not sure, it was John Humphrey, was a minister in the Pandey administration. He had got involved in the award of a contract for the construction of an interchange at the intersection of the Uriah Butler Highway and the Churchill Roosevelt Highway. And there were two parties involved. One was Presticon, I believe was one, and the other party was Century Eslon. And both of them had tendered for this project, which was to build something a little different to what is there now, but it would have ended up in a grade-separated interchange. And there was a dispute, and one of the parties, I believe it was Century Eslon,
took the matter to court. The judge at that time, he's now a justice of appeal. It was Judge Mark Mohammed, and the decision was not rendered until 2006. And as a result, that procurement process was stalled for 5 years. And it was not appealed. If it was appealed, it could have taken another 5 years. So for 10 years, that procurement related to the construction of a very important project, the construction of an interchange at the intersection of the two busiest roads in Trinidad and Tobago, could have been stalled for 10 years. It was in fact stalled for 5. And in fact, there was a sum of money allocated for the project, which was eventually vired when the PNM government came into office. The money was allocated in the expectation that the court matter would be disposed of quickly. It wasn't. It took about 5 or 6 years. And that sum of money was eventually vired out of the ministry responsible for the entity at the time. I believe it was planning and development at the time, and used for the construction of public housing. So the money couldn't even be used because the money had been appropriated for the purpose of that project. And because it was stuck, and because the procurement could not proceed, the money eventually was redirected and used for another purpose, for government housing. But the whole point is that that project was stalled there for 5 or 6 years. There's another famous case, and that is NH International versus Unicot, and that was over the construction of the customs building, which again was stalled for many years while that matter was being resolved. And there was a view, NH International had a view at the time, that the decision of Unicot to award that contract to Hafiz Karamat, yes, Hafiz Karamat, was wrong, and that they were of the view that they should have been awarded the contract instead. So they took the matter to court, and I got stuck in court as well. And in fact, that decision, that NH International versus Unicot decision, is the law in Trinidad and Tobago right now. It went to the High Court. It was Justice Stallmeyer in the High Court. And then it went to the Court of Appeal. It was Margot Warner, Kangaloo, and Sharma who rendered the Court of Appeal decision, a 2-1 decision in the Court of Appeal. But be that as it may, it was a majority decision and is now the law of Trinidad and Tobago, which is that public bodies are commercial entities, and they are allowed to exercise their best judgment with respect to procurement and award of contracts, and that their decisions cannot be overturned or substituted if, unless fraud or some gross irrationality is discovered. And that was the crux of the matter in that particular case. The claimants were unable to prove fraud or irrationality to the extent that it would have undermined the decision making, and the decision of Unicot at the time to award the contract to Karamat was upheld. And it was based on a number of decisions all throughout the English Commonwealth, especially based on decisions in Australia. There was and in New Zealand in particular, a famous case of Pratt Contractors versus Transit New Zealand, where the same argument was leveled at Transit New Zealand, which was a public authority in New Zealand, similar, I guess, to our PTSC or some other similar transportation entity in Trinidad and Tobago. And they had awarded a contract to a particular contractor, and Pratt Contractors objected on the grounds, again, that they should have been given the contract. And the decision of the Privy Council in that particular case was, unless you can prove fraud or unless there are sufficient public law elements in the matter, the court was not allowed to substitute itself for the decision makers who would be reviewing the tenders and doing an evaluation and making a decision with respect to the procurement. And that
ruling was followed, has been followed in many other jurisdictions. And in fact, Mark Mohammed that I just referred to, he used 2 Canadian decisions along the same lines, that public authorities are commercial entities, and unless you can establish fraud or public law elements, you cannot interfere with the decision of a public authority with respect to the award of a contract. Now this is very important to what we are doing here in the Senate here today, because the public law element is the legislation of tender rules. We have a Central Tenders Board Act, and there are rules associated with that Central Tenders Board Act. And once you fall within the framework of the Central Tenders Board Act, an aggrieved person can approach the High Court and ask the High Court to look at the decisions made by the Central Tenders Board with respect to an award of contract. That's the public law element in it, the act itself, the Central Tenders Board Act. But for state enterprises, these enterprises are exempt from the provisions of the Central Tenders Board Act, and therefore do not fall within that body of public law. What we are doing with this Procurement and Public Disposal of Public Property Act is we are now legalizing or legislating the incorporation of the tender rules of state enterprises and other government entities within the ambit of this legislation, and therefore bringing them within public law. So once we finish here, and once this act is fully proclaimed, because it's only partially proclaimed, any aggrieved person will be able to challenge any decision made by any state enterprise with respect to the award of a contract for goods and services. It is a fundamental shift in the way we do business here in Trinidad and Tobago, because this will be for the first time would a contractor or any other claimant would be able to challenge the award of a contract made by an entity like Petrotrin or NIDCO, for example, with respect to who should get the contract. And it would not be limited to fraud or gross irregularity. The court could now look into the evaluation process and the reasons given for the award of contract, the scores, and the various points given for elements like price and technical competence and so on of the various tenderers. And the court will now be able to get involved in determining whether a contract should stand or whether a contract should fall. In that context, and in the experience of the interchange project, which was delayed for 6 years, and the customs billing, which was also delayed for several years, although those cases were unsuccessful, not because of the absence of a public law element, there will now be a public law element. And therefore, the court will be able to provide injunctive relief. Somebody could apply to restrain an entity from awarding a contract. That can now happen with this public procurement legislation. We felt, because of the experience in Trinidad, because things move very, very, very slowly in Trinidad and Tobago, and anybody who thinks otherwise, I mean, we also had some decisions made recently which are not really relevant to this, but within the wider judicial system, where things have been in the pipeline for 10 and 11 years, and you probably have to start all over again from scratch. It may take 22 years for them. So we felt that in that context of the slow pace at which litigation progresses in Trinidad and Tobago, for whatever reason it is, I'm not casting any aspersions here, I'm just dealing with facts, that we felt we should have an intermediate stage in the process of a challenge of a decision made. So as it now stands, an aggrieved person can apply to the procurement regulator to examine an award of a contract by a state enterprise, as the Procurement Act now stands, although it's not fully proclaimed. And the procurement regulator would render a decision, and as is customary, the person can ask the procurement regulator to take another look at it, take a second look at it. They can query it or ask them to review their own decision. And after that, if the procurement regulator confirms their decision, the only place the aggrieved party has to go is to the court. So we felt, and this is emerging best practice all over the world, that we should have a non-judicial body, a review board, which would have very strict time frames to examine what the procurement regulator does and render a decision within a short period of time. And the time frames given to the review board, when they get a request to review, the request itself must be made within 21 days of the decision of the procurement office, and the review board must conduct a review within 21 days of receiving the request, and they must complete it within 28 days of receiving the request for the review. So, pardon? Somebody said that? I'm sorry. Yeah, so that the when you introduce this review board now, they must complete their work within 28 days of receiving a request for review of a decision of the procurement office. Now, that's very similar to what takes place in the United Kingdom. There's something called an adjudication system in the United Kingdom, where you have persons who are not judges, but they are experienced practitioners in the construction industry. They could be quantity surveyors or other persons who have the necessary qualifications and experience. And if there's a dispute with respect to a construction project in UK, the aggrieved person can apply to the adjudication board, who would then appoint a adjudicator, an experienced person, who must render a decision within 28 days. And that decision stands until it's overturned by a court. And the reason why they came up with that system in the United Kingdom is that it's based on a decision from a famous judge, Lord Deming. And funny enough, this decision was overturned. But his view was that money is the lifeblood of the construction industry. If you stop a project, you create problems because the contractor can't get cash flow. And if a contractor can't get cash flow, then the whole thing just comes tumbling down. So the view was you need to have quick decision making with respect to these matters. You have to move fast. It's either you agree with the contractor or you don't agree. But you need to tell them so that they can make arrangements as to their next step with respect to a project. And that is why the adjudication system in UK determines that you must make a decision in 28 days. So a person makes a complaint, you must say 28 days later whether the person is right or whether they are wrong. And as I said, that decision stands. So we felt we would borrow that experience out of the UK and compel the review board to make its decision within 28 days. And to make sure you have the proper competence in this review board, the composition of the board is a retired judge who shall be the chairman, a registered engineer with at least 10 years experience in matters relating to procurement, and a chartered accountant or quantity surveyor with at least 10 years experience in matters relating to procurement. So we felt we would give the review board a certain skill set, and they have the 28 days to look at it. And what we felt would be the beneficial outcome of this is that if a person, an aggrieved contractor, complains to the procurement regulator that they are not satisfied with a decision and their complaint is dismissed or rejected, then they go to the review board, and the review board again looks at it, and within 20 days will say, we uphold the decision of the regulator. So they've had two passes now through serious, competent tribunals. They go first through the office of the procurement regulator, who says your complaint is not justified, and then secondly through the office of the review board, who would say again your complaint is not justified. We felt that the vast majority of complainants would stop at that point in time, because you've gone through two, and now 4 people, 3 from the ParlView board and 1 from the procurement regulator, have told you that their complaint is not justified. And now, if you decide to go to court, well, you have a long haul in front of you, and a lot of people will stop at that stage. They would decide they would not go forward to litigation. And we felt that this would improve the system considerably, reduce costs and reduce time, reduce disputes, and put some order into the system. It is all in keeping with the overriding objective of the civil proceedings rules, which is to avoid litigation. That's the overriding objective. I'm not sure if that objective is achieved, but that's the objective in Trinidad and Tobago, that you try to get mediation, conciliation, out-of-court settlements before the matter finds its way into the court system. And once it's in, it's very hard to come back out without somebody having to pay something to somebody. So we felt this review board was an improvement, and it is in fact in place in another country. In fact, it was borrowed from that country, from Kenya, and they have a well-functioning review board in that jurisdiction, and we felt that this was an improvement to the system. Now, I must say, I want to thank everybody who participated in the deliberations of the Joint Select Committee. We had some very fruitful and very exhaustive deliberations. I want to especially thank Senator Small for his attendance at all the meetings and his vigorous participation in the deliberations of the committee. I think there was one item that was not agreed to by the opposition member who attended the meeting, so that was Dr. Tiwari, and that was the review board, but I felt there was a philosophical point. I felt that the arguments were not persuasive in terms of not creating a review board, and every other member of the committee agreed that we should have this interim body to avoid litigation. And that is basically it. I want to say I didn't come here to bust any mark. I think this is a very serious matter. I think we need to get on with it. This thing is waiting. The industry is waiting. And we just, with the leave of the Senate, I would ask honorable members to approve this legislation. It has gone through a Joint Select Committee. There was only one dissenting voice. Everybody else was in agreement. And we are ready to implement the new procurement system. And we are ready. It's going to be quite a challenge, because what you have to do is to create an entity in each state entity now. So you have to create a procurement office in each entity, and all of these procurement offices have to report to the procurement regulator, who has the power to come in, to stop a procurement process, to overturn a decision, to suspend a process. It's going to be quite a challenge. And as I said, we are now making this part of our law, so that it will also mean that the courts are now going to be allowed to get involved in public procurement. This is going to affect public procurement in a profound manner in Trinidad and Tobago, but I think in the interest of transparency, accountability, even though it may slow us down a little bit, because it will. There's no two ways about it. Once claimants can now go through all these various stages, and these bodies will have the power to suspend proceedings, it is going to slow us down. It's going to happen. But we think that whatever delay there may be, and I mean that is just a view, it may not be so at all, we believe it's worth it. That because we have contentious arguments in this country all the time about who thief what, from who, when, where, and how. Once you have this system in place, you would have a far more, sure, I'm nearly done. You're going to have a far more open system, so that the public will understand what is going on. People will see, and the court can get involved and deal with abuse of office by persons who are involved in the award of contracts. So with those few words, Madam President, I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015 be now read a second time.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We are very happy to join this debate on a bill entitled an act to amend the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015. We on this side are very happy to be associated with being the lead pioneers, with the support of others, of course, in bringing to this Parliament and to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago genuine procurement reform. And by passing good and effective law with strong sanctions and with clear procedures. And this is what the Parent Act called Act Number 1 of 2015 is about. No other party has been able to do it. 55 years, the Central Tenders Board Act, 1961. Even whilst we were in the grips of colonialism and British rule, we were governed by the Central Tenders Board Act. There were a number of refinements to that act when special purpose companies were introduced, and many of them UDCOT, MTS, NIPDEC, bypassed the Central Tenders Board. But that was all part of the journey as amendments were brought to the Central Tenders Board Act of 1961. I want to say, Madam President, that this amendment and the Parent Act in particular was the subject of an elaborate process of consultation and consensus building prior to passage in the both houses. The act which is now in place was endorsed by the UNDP, by the European Union, by the IADB. I understand it was also endorsed by the World Bank and many other international bodies and agencies. So it was all part of a suite of legislation brought by the then People's Partnership Administration to improve governance in Trinidad and Tobago. This legislation, Madam President, which is the Parent 1, Act Number 1 of 2015, if you look, I think it's Clause 5, if I'm not mistaken, Madam President. It deals with the objects of the Act in Clause 5, where we speak to the issue of the principles of accountability and integrity and transparency and value for money. there is even a definition of what is meant by value for money in the interpretation section of the Act. It also dealt with efficiency, Madam President, and fairness, and equity, and public confidence. And it dealt with industry development, sustainable procurement, and sustainable development. We have just signed off on the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them, on the 25th of September, 2015. And procurement cannot be seen in isolation from this thrust to promote sustainable development in our country. It is designed to promote, Madam President, local content, local industry, local labor, sustainable development practices, fair competition, and as I said, transparency and accountability. But most importantly, as the Honorable Minister said, and there are many instances in this country of the citizens not getting value for their money, where there are several instances of irregularities, financial mismanagement, nepotism, and corruption. This Act and its amendment in which we are dealing with today, Madam President, seeks to address the issue of corruption. And it does that in Clause 9 of the Parent Act, with the establishment of the Procurement Regulation. The Office of Procurement Regulation is an independent, autonomous, transparent body where political interference has been avoided, or every attempt has been made to avoid political interference. And that has been done through the appointment of the procurement regulator by the President of the Republic, appointing after consultation with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. All in an effort to lift that veil of political intrusion and interference. And the procurement regulation is about scrutiny, because the Parent Act, along with the amendment, deals with a system of centralization and decentralization at the same time. Public entities and public bodies that use public monies are going to continue to carry on their business. They are going to continue to award contracts, but they'll be guided by manuals, guidelines, Madam President, issued by procurement regulation, and the chief there, the procurement regulator. So we need to understand that the procurement office or the procurement regulation is about scrutinizing, Madam President, matters, awards of contracts that would come before it. The procurement regulation and the procurement regulator do not determine contracts. That must be made abundantly clear. That is done by the public entities. Doesn't matter which one, NP, Petrotrin, NGC, they will do their own thing, MTS. They will do their own thing. And Madam President, they will then send their awards, if they have to post on their website all the information. and the public body that is going to scrutinize those awards to determine that everything is above board would be the Public Regulation Office, which is above the political cut and thrust of the hustings. So that office has the power to investigate and to enforce. They have the power to impose heavy fines on any organization and office that violates or contravenes the legislation. But I want to say that we have a fundamental philosophical difference with the government's position as manifested in this report that is before us. We do not believe, Madam President, in duplication. We do not believe that we should be promoting inefficiency and ineffectiveness in the operations of the Procurement Regulation Office or the procurement regulator. And no politician, either on this side or on the other side, should do anything to contaminate, pollute, or undermine the office of the procurement regulation. And as I said, Madam President, we have a philosophical difference. So we do not support, let me make it abundantly clear, a review board. We will show and demonstrate that the review of contracts and awards are in the current parent legislation. So why do you want to create a second layer when it is already in the parent legislation? And my honorable colleague from the Gomate Northeast, Minister of Finance, spoke about Kenya. And I have a manual here, Madam President, which was circulated about what is taking place in that country. It's a very convoluted process in Kenya. Our legislation is much more progressive and much more efficient than that of Kenya. This is 21st century procurement legislation that can become a model of many countries today. So we don't have to take that from Kenya. In fact, the evidence is showing, Madam President, that if we go along with the Minister's Review Board, it will take 44 days before a decision is taken by the Review Board. Whereas in our legislation, currently constructed, it will take 20 days. So what are we trying to achieve? What is the objective? So, Madam President, we have some reservations, and there is politics contaminating this process here. The ministers seem to want to be involved in the review process. And we do not want the Minister of Finance or any of his colleagues to be involved in the review process in whatever way. If you want a review board and you want us to compromise with you, give the review board the same status as the Procurement Regulation Office. We want autonomy, we want independence, we want transparency, and we want publicity in any matter where there's a challenge. We do not belong to the lodges, so we do not operate in secrecy. We allow the sunshine of we allow the rays, I should say, of the sunshine to penetrate the walls of this chamber and this country. That is what we are committed to achieving. We do not like darkness. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do it. And therefore, we are about light. We are about shining. That is why we have the rising sun. You get the rays of the sun every morning. No matter what you do, when you rise in the morning, the sun rises in the morning with you. So the glow is always there. Not the Balize with snake. Not about Balize and snake. Madam President, it's about the rising sun, Madam President. So, Madam President, as I said, this process went through so many incarnations. 2 joint select committees. The Senate, including Senator Stuart Young, who is now the Attorney General of this country.
Acting.
Well, acting, but I know you want to take over. But, Madam President, you know what? It went through many incarnations. And yet the record would show that Senator Stuart Young, in another incarnation, was in total support of this measure.
Senator Mark, please refer to members by their designation. The Honourable Stuart Young is no longer a senator.
He is a member of Parliament for Port Spain North. Only temporarily. Temporarily. Yes, so Madam President...
He's also minister in the office of the Attorney General. No, we refer, when members are ministers, we refer to them by their designation.
The Honourable Acting Attorney General, do I say that now? Oh, okay. Yeah. I think so. So, Madam President, as I said, we have a problem, a fundamental difference with the PNM administration as it relates to the review board. So we want that to be noted very early. We are prepared to generate and circulate amendments to that. But as I said, Madam President, I do not want the Minister of Finance to disturb me while I'm speaking.
That's leprechaun behavior, man.
Madam President, what I'm saying, Madam President, is that as far as we are concerned, we would want to ensure that if the Minister of Finance is inclined to step down from that tall ladder that he's on and become a little more compromising and accommodating, we are prepared to accommodate a review board. But I am saying on the condition that the review board must have the same independence, autonomy, and authority as the Procurement Regulation Office. If you are not prepared to give that, we are not prepared to support your measure. So we are very flexible, and we want to compromise, because we all are committed to the establishment of procurement legislation in this country, because we want procurement legislation in this land. We want to eliminate corruption because there's plenty going on in this country, and especially in Tobago. I want to tell the people of Tobago, and we are going to be shouting from the rooftop at the appropriate time. There will be no accountability. There will be no autonomy until there's proper accountability for Tobago. We are going to ensure that there's proper accountability in Tobago before you talk about autonomy. And the amount of corruption I have before me in terms of what is taking place in Tobago, it will make any entity in Trinidad and Tobago look like child's play. It's madness, but I won't detain you at this time on this matter. It's bundles of bundles, you know, all kind of things. And as I'm on my legs, I know that there is they give contracts out to someone, they say in the Senate right now, to repair community centers and schools and so on, worth tens of millions of dollars without any tendering process, I understand. I won't call names at this time.
You imputing improper motives to a
I'm
member of the
saying that
Senate?
The people of Tobago are saying.
Well,
but there are
if the people of Tobago are saying through you, then you are saying it, Senator Mark. So if you are referring to a member of the Senate, please don't impute improper motives.
Well, I'm not imputing it yet. No. I'll bring the evidence. No, I say I'll bring the evidence. And when I bring the substantive evidence through a substantive motion, you will know exactly who I am speaking about. But for the time being, I hold back. I hold back. Look, listen, you.
Senator Mark.
Why is this coming up?
Senator Mark, please restrict yourself to the matters that are before us,
But
please.
I am.
Senator Mark, please. And no, please, you respond to what the Minister of Finance has said without speaking to the Minister of Finance.
I'm not speaking to him, I dare not speak to him. I speak to you.
Thank you.
I always look at you.
Thank you.
Not speak to him. Madam President, what we are saying here is that we are committed to supporting the Honorable Minister on the review board question, but it must be along the lines that I'm going to suggest. Madam President, we looked at the legislation in the amended form that is before us, Madam President. And we are asking, Madam President, why, for instance, if we go to the legislation directly, go to section 3, Madam President, and go to C, 3CH. I have no problem, and we have no problem with the procurement regulator being told you cannot trade. You cannot trade. We have no problem with that. We support that. But why must he get the prior approval of the minister? How the minister got into this thing, Madam President? We are saying leave the minister out. The minister has no business in that. Is the minister trying to worm his way into this body to influence outcomes? I don't know. It is possible. And we have to protect the interests of the nation. And this is why, Madam President, we are saying it should be the approval of the Parliament. Get the Parliament involved. You withdraw money from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. You came here today, give us a non-answer to the people's questions and concern. But you know what? You'll have to bring legislation here, one day. And one of the things that you have to do is to ensure that any future withdrawal from the people's national savings, you must have parliamentary approval. Right now we can do anything. And come here and show contempt towards the people as if that's your personal account.
Senator Mark.
Not you, Madam.
Senator Mark, please, just get back to what you're debating, all right? And forget about those extra comments that you're making.
What do you say?
Senator Mark.
What does he say?
I don't know because I am listening to you, Senator Mark. Please have a seat. It's either, Senator Mark, you want to contribute to the debate and speak to me and address the presiding officer, or you want to chat with the Minister of Finance outside the chamber.
I prefer to chat with you.
Thank you.
Not with him at all. I don't chat with men. Chat with you. I have no business with the Minister of Finance. None. Except to get him out of office as quickly as I can. Anyway, Madam President, let me turn to you because you are more amenable.
Easy on the eye.
And easy on the eye, too. Madam President, what you?
She said she's not easy on the eye.
Mark, please, I know there's a lot of levity, but really that's an improper Even if it is said in I know, in the spirit, but let's be professional in the chamber. Thank you.
I would draw it if it hurt anyone. Anyone is harmed, please forgive me. Madam President, what is the Minister of Finance doing in this section of the legislation? We are saying the Minister of Finance has no business in this matter. And under Section 3, we are saying if these people cannot trade, the Minister has no authority to give them approval to trade. The only body that can give them approval to trade is the Parliament. And we are proposing a change to ensure that the Parliament is responsible for what is going on at that level. That is what we are saying. Not the Minister. The Minister might have his own objective. Not this one, you know. It might be me, because I'm replacing him very shortly. They're only there temporarily, wasting time. People fed up with them. Call an election now, they're gone. Afraid to call it. So, Madam President, let's go to this particular matter again. And we are saying that in terms of trade, we have no problem with that. We believe that it's a very eminently reasonable proposal that these people who are members of the board ought not to be involved in trade. So we have no problem with that whatsoever. Madam President, we have a problem. I come back to the review board. The review board, Madam President, it seems to us, will be looking at matters that are brought before it. 3 of them, a judge, an engineer, a quantity surveyor, or an accountant, or a combination of 3 of them, Madam President, with the judge being chairman. But the judge that is going to be chairman, along with his 2 members, are going to be deliberating on matters in secret. I want the Minister of Finance to tell us if, for instance, public hearings on the matters that are going before those gentlemen and or ladies called the review board or the procurement review board, Madam Chair, President, whether that is going to be held like a lodge in secret, or whether it will have the transparency of the Procurement Regulation Office, because the Procurement Regulation Office will be holding its hearings in public. So if the minister can clarify for us, Madam President, whether the review board is going to be in secret or whether it is going to be in public, we await his comments on this matter. And I see something very strange in 51F, where the minister, where is the minister going? Why does he want to intrude in procurement business? We want the regulation office to be responsible for procurement. And Madam President, may I inform you, with this convoluted kind of system, this new layer of bureaucracy, Madam President, this undermining and watering down of the procurement regulation and procurement regulator. The minister is not telling us, Madam President, that in 51F, he will have the responsibility to make regulations. And you know what? He's going to have it on a negative basis. We don't want it on a negative basis if he decides to listen to us. We want it on an affirmative basis. And we will be so advising him through an amendment. And in addition, with respect to staffing, remuneration, funding, and other operation matters of the review board. So the minister, Madam President, after someone has appealed the decision of the Procurement Regulation Office and the Procurement Office and Regulator, they will now be able to go before the review board. But you know who is going to determine the staff in there? The politician.
Minister.
Why is the minister getting involved in procurement business? We do not want the minister to be involved. And therefore, we are proposing an amendment to allow the Office of Procurement Regulation to be in charge of the appointment of staff in this instance. We want them to appoint staff. Let them determine with the Cabinet or the Salaries Review Commission remuneration. The minister must provide funding. That is what he must provide. And this thing about the matter of the sale of land, I think this is a matter that we could quibble over, but we are also convinced that this is a matter that the minister should leave, Madam President, alone. The minister should not be involved in this matter. So under 57A, we see where the minister may make regulations in respect of the disposal of lands. And these regulations are going to be subject to negative resolution. Why is the minister being allowed, Madam President, to make regulations and subject those regulations to a negative resolution dealing with the sale of land? Madam President, we would prefer the Office of Procurement, and even if we were to compromise and say the minister, even if we were supposed to, if we decide, Madam President, we are saying that it must be subject to an affirmative resolution of the Parliament. So we are very clear that there are several amendments that we are going to be circulating for the consideration of this Parliament in order to ensure, Madam President, that this particular piece of legislation is not polluted, is not contaminated by the PNM. Because we are seeing certain things happening, and we are going to be watching with hawk eyes how these things are unfolding. When I occupy another incarnation, I was in charge of the Red House and the restoration of the Red House and any project surrounding the Red House. Whether it involves hundreds of millions, we were in charge. The Parliament was in charge. There was a separation of powers. Today we understand that the Prime Minister's office is now in charge of the project for the restoration of the Red House. We ask the question, why? And why is the Minister of Finance so silent on this matter? He was the first one to jump up when he heard about some event that was unfolding and said, who wants to take over this project? He will not stand for it. The Parliament was in charge. Today the Parliament is not in charge. We ask why, but we are looking. We want to know if there's a particular contractor who they want to give that contract to. And we are looking, we are watching, and we are determining at the appropriate time. What? Yes, that is why you have the review board. And that is why we want it. Because the review board could give the possibility of the minister. I'm not saying this minister, I do not accuse him of anything. He's a decent individual. He's a decent individual. So I have nothing against the minister. Nothing against the minister. Nothing against the minister. All I'm saying is any minister, Madam President, if you do not curb their power and their influence, they can corrupt the process. And that is what I'm concerned about. We are concerned about the corruption of the process. To give your friends and your family the contract. That is what we are concerned about. So, Madam President, this...
You have 5 more minutes.
Madam President, only? Madam President, you know, time rushes on very quickly in this parliament, I realize. Yeah, that's why we need to increase it again. Yeah. Anyway, Madam President, we feel that the matters that before us require some compromises. We are prepared to meet with the Honorable Minister and his team to bring about some compromises because we are all committed to procurement legislation. This is our law. We brought it. We are proud of it, and we will support changes to make it stronger. So we are not against our own legislation. We are in support of our legislation. And Madam President, we want this thing overnight. Because if this was enforced today, we would have known why we must go and launch a bank called UMA. From Miami to Bahamas, Madam President, costing $450,000. And I hope what I'm hearing is not true. The son of Yuma, the son of the band leader of Yuma, is a party financier of the ruling party. That's what I understand. Somebody could deny that. Mr. Huggins, you're the PRO. You know about money. So you might tell us. The leader of the band, the leader of Yuma, is the son of a P&M financier. So, Madam President, we had asked the Honorable Minister, Madam President, and we had brought an amendment. When he came to raise $50 billion, we brought an amendment saying, do not raise any money, Madam President, until procurement legislation was passed in its fullest form. We asked the minister today, how many contracts have been issued that you are aware of under your watch since September 7th? We are now going, Madam President, into almost 8 months since this committee work had started, and we are debating it in the 8th month, going into the 9th month. And we haven't gotten from the minister. All we heard from him this evening is that he would like to implement this measure quickly. But you know, Madam President, we haven't got the time schedule. I challenge the minister today to provide this parliament with a schedule, a time schedule, as to when this legislation will become law in its totality. We want a schedule of implementation. We want to operationalize this law. We want this law to come into effect, Madam President, by a certain date. We feel, Madam President, this law should be effected no later than December 31st. Madam President, this law should be operationalized by December 31st of this year.
Too far, man. That's too far.
Yeah, but we are getting the impression from the minister, based on submissions made to him as chairman of the committee, Joint Select Committee, that more amendments are coming. Because the Board of Permanent Secretaries don't like this. And this one don't like that. And he's on record as saying they may have to go to the parent legislation. Because what they were advancing were not pertinent to what was before him. So the question must be asked, are we to expect further amendments in the coming months? That is something that you must clear up. But, Madam President, we are all for procurement. We support procurement. We brought this legislation. There were a lot of challenges, but we fought. There were challenges and battles, and we are here today. And we want to work with the government with a view to having a unanimous decision today. We would like this legislation to be unanimously approved, but there must be give and take. There must be negotiations. There must be compromises in order for us, Madam President, to get the best package for the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. We want the best package for the people of this country. There are many issues that are disturbing us. And I want to say, Madam President, in closing, I serve notice that in due course or in short order, I have been approached by the people of Tobago.
Senator, mark your time, sir.
Thank you.
Senator Small.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for giving me the opportunity to join in this debate. After the usually spirited performance by our colleague from the opposition benches, I can only hope to try to bring some sanity to the proceedings. Madam President, I want to start off today by extending my appreciation to the team of people who worked in the Joint Select Committee. I sat as part of that process, as the chairman of that process, the Minister of Finance. I think managed the meetings very well. At many times, the discussions were very spirited, but I felt it was also conducted in a very positive manner. I think the support of the team from the CPC, especially for someone like me who was actually the first time dealing with a bill in the Joint Select Committee, I think that helped me to understand a lot of the things that perhaps were not very clear to everyone. And my own view, respectfully, Madam President, that we have an excellent set of amendments here inside of this bill. And I think that the issue for me is that we are here to deal with an issue that is long overdue. We are here to try to see how we could plug the gaps and get this amendment bill through and get the actual Parent Act fully operationalized. Madam President, I would always am record in this Parliament, I've seen on many occasions, no legislation will ever be perfect. It will never be perfect. And I've also said that I'm willing to accept a 70 or 80% solution because we need to get something in place. And as far as the issue of corruption, which doesn't exist, I'm going to deal with that later on. It doesn't exist because I will come to that, Madam President. And Madam President, as the Honourable Minister of Finance is here, he should feel comforted that today I'm not going to talk about the FCB IPO. I'm not going to be talking about the people that own the Clico FCU, why no one has yet made a jail, why nobody has been arrested, charged. I'm not going to be talking about the tax-free savings bonds that I'm yet to see what is happening to help the citizens of this country. I'm not going to be talking about those things, Madam President. So the Minister of Finance can relax. I'm not going to be talking about the bank fees, the atrocious, atrocious bank fees, Madam President. I'm not going to talk about the fact that one of the regally named banks in this country asks you when you're traveling overseas, please give us your itinerary, exactly where it will be, and we'll make sure your card is working. And when I traveled recently, I call them, I do everything, and then my card doesn't work. I call them, I email them, they never respond. Luckily, I thank God for FCB and Scotiabank. Yeah? These are issues that, Madam President, the regular citizen in this country is facing. And when people want to apply fees and then can't deliver the service, something has to be done. Madam President, when we talk about procurement in this country, I think that public procurement is a huge slice of the economic activity in this country. When I looked at the estimates of revenue, I recognize that over 120 state agencies, authorities, ministries spend over $15 billion a year. That's a huge amount of money in terms of expenditure on procurement and in terms of things of transport, waste management, social protection, health, education services. The public authorities are the principal buyers in this economy. And we need to have a system to monitor that and deal with that properly. Madam President, the history of public procurement has seen the questioning of many and several transactions that have come into question in the public domain. I think that it's very likely that the transactions that have been flagged and deemed impacted by corruption, whatever that is actually very likely to be a small percentage of the things that have fallen under the bus in terms of having an appropriate procedure and having the correct things done. I believe, Madam President, that grand corruption is perpetuated and being perpetuated in this country at an alarming rate, and with petty corruption becoming endemic and is almost impossible to stop. Madam President, I also want to say that when I looked around, the minister in his contribution spoke about the system in the UK, but I also looked at the US system, and they have something called a centralized system for award management. And when I looked at it, one of the very interesting factors or operational factors inside of there is that they have a list of something called the excluded parties. This is a public register of persons and organizations who are excluded from receiving federal contracts. And this is where they've recognized that people who have been party have done things that are not correct are excluded from future consideration. And that lends a level of rigidness to the system, that if you know that you've been involved in something shady and that will impact your future ability to get work, then you will not do something shady and try to keep your stuff on track. Perhaps when we look at the future and in the way in which we do things, that is something we have to think about, because you keep hearing about the same parties allegedly involved in activities and then they get other contracts. So something has to be done. We have to find a way to treat that, because it just doesn't make sense. Accusing someone of wrongdoing and then right after they're bidding and getting further contracts. It's not logical to me. Madam President, I want to say something here, and the relevance of it will evolve as I talk about the review board. I want to talk about jumping to conclusions, Madam President. Jumping to conclusions is where you attach an assumption to an untested belief, and then you bend the narrative to support the assumption. Madam President is smiling. I think Madam President understands very well where I'm going. Yeah. And Madam President, I refer back to the standing orders 46.6, and it's interesting for me. It says that no senator shall make an imputation of improper motives against any member, any offensive reference to a member's private affairs, a personal reflection against a member, or an allegation of bribery of corruption. So that members are not allowed to do that. But what about other parties aligned to the state? I'm going to deal with that comprehensively today, Madam President, because it is not to be tolerated. It is not to be tolerated under any circumstances. Madam President, as we saw earlier today, members come here and swear on the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita, and they swear to perform this work conscientiously and impartially. Anybody willing to challenge that I stood there and I swore on the Bible and I swear to do that, and you want to challenge me on that, I take umbrage. Madam President, the key amendment, for me, I'm going to start with the review board, because I believe that this, for me, is something that we've spoken about. And I believe that the review board is actually a second level of oversight. And I agree with everybody, all the views, that it adds another layer of bureaucracy. That's completely correct. But here's what it also does. For the person who is, or the party who is bent on doing something untoward, they recognize if I'm in an entity and we're doing a procurement, it's going to have to go to the procurement agency, and then it's going to have to likely go to the review board. So that starts to lock you in. Perhaps I may have to try to do this thing correctly. So you have another layer. So while I agree that it's another layer of bureaucracy, there's no question, and it actually may make some of the processes a bit longer. But I think we need some of that, because too many people are able to get away things unscathed. Madam President, I want to share with these members here. In my role as random citizen yesterday afternoon, I'm going into a supermarket, and I am stopped by a well-attired young gentleman. Senator, can I have a word with you? I'm like, certainly. And he goes on to describe to me how he's in a particular position in a state entity, and the things that he's seen he's not happy with. And every time he's spoken about it, he's gotten tapped up. And these things, that person could be just random person who's aggrieved for whatever reason. But when people approach you like that, you have to try to figure out, and I am having this a 20-minute conversation with this young professional, and he's laying out to me some issues that I won't repeat, but it helps me to understand that we have a real problem with procurement. A real problem. Madam President, my recent experience of the arrogance and disrespect for parliamentary committees by state entities who seem to think that they are not bound to provide information to fully account for their activities further buttresses the need for a review board. These arrogant actions, in one case, have descended to the level of personal accusations that have zero basis. And it seems to be purely aimed at trying to intimidate me in the performance of the work that I have sworn in the Bible to perform in this house. And I take umbrage to it. For the record, Madam President, I refuse to be intimidated by any person, group, or organization in carrying out the responsibility for which I have sworn an oath. I take it very seriously. I take challenges to my professionalism very seriously. That is the basis upon how I work. I don't know how to do anything else other than be professional. People seem to have given zero consideration to the fact that as a professional, I'm able to compartmentalize my various responsibilities and deal with them in its own way. All I've been advocating, Madam President, is that all state universities must understand that they are and must be fully accountable for state funds and all their actions. That's it. That's all I've been advocating. The procurement body, Madam President, is not immune from this requirement, and in my respectful view, the review board will help to ensure that there's a subjudicial avenue to settle disagreements. Madam President, review of actions of agencies is absolutely critical. It is now part of the permanent record of the Parliament that a state entity has made accusations against a member of Parliament, of this Parliament, on the basis that they sought to have this member expelled from a public hearing. Madam President, through you, I'm saying to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, you have a state entity who, for their own reasons, is levying accusations that they have no basis and are trying to enforce action against the Parliament. That is not to be tolerated. Insofar as they had the gall to do this, Madam President, at all. I'm coming.
Yes. Well, let me just caution you a little bit. I think you may be referring to matters before a joint select committee.
No, Madam President.
No? All right, because I just want to caution that we be very circumspect before matters are dealt with a final report about what we see. All right? Because you have the in-camera proceedings and then you have the public proceedings.
Thank you, Madam President, and I appreciate your guidance, because these are issues, Madam President, that require specific action. They require specific action, and insofar as I am a member of this Parliament, and I take this responsibility seriously, I believe that if someone has a challenge, there's a route. For the avoidance of doubt, Madam President, I'm willing to put this matter to rest. I am just making sure that my views on the matter are clearly understood. I hold no grudges. I just believe that when we do things, we should try to do things in a proper way. And if you want to engage with people, do it in an appropriate manner. Madam President, in the words of the great Mahatma Gandhi, the weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. And there's a particular quote that I have actually stuck up over my computer at home that I use it all the time. I've faced many challenges in my few short years on this planet. And the great Mahatma Gandhi said, when you're dealing with how he, as an individual, dealt with challenges and he persisted, he said, and I quote, first, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. And then you win. Madam President, in the same way that the proposed review board has the power to rescind decisions of the procurement agencies, perhaps it's time for us to consider that the committee system here is given some additional authorities to have sanctions. And I'm saying that deliberately because I think that where we are, the review board allows for a higher level and additional level of oversight, but it also has the authority to review, rescind contracts. And that is huge because parties who are starting a process here have to understand it has to go to the procurement regulator, but it also has to go to the review board. So that what you know is that even if you are bent on doing something wrong, you have two levels that you have to go through that very likely, if you're doing something that's not correct, you could be caught. Madam President, I believe that procurement challenges exist as it is right now. Many state entities are facing issues with how they manage procurement. One of the issues that I have asked, Madam President, and I've stated it publicly, we need to probably look at something called value for money audits. Many entities are not entities that are designed to earn profits. They are there to provide services to the citizens of the country. But it does not mean that we cannot make an assessment as to whether or not the monies that have been applied by that agency and in terms of procurement to ensure that the government and the people of Trinidad and Tobago get value for money. Another issue, Madam President, in public procurement that has come up is what I call contract management issues. You end up signing contracts with parties, and then when those contracts, for whatever reason, parties are in disagreement, you find that the contracts many times are adverse to the state agency, and the state ends up with a situation where it almost has no recourse but to pay. And I think that there needs to be a harder look at what I've termed contract management issues. So those are issues that I think that require some looking at, and I'm sure the procurement agency would look at those things, but I want to flag those things. The other issue, Madam President, I want to talk about is something called bid rigging. I noted in the other place that it was stated that bid rigging is now an offense, and perhaps I have actually had experience seeing what I see as bid rigging. I have sat in agencies and seen tenders come, and if, let's say, the in-house estimate is $5 million, a bidder bids $4,990,000. But you sit in the agency and you're like, they meet all the technical requirements and they're below the in-house estimate, and they're also the lowest bid. You struggle. But the problem is you can't finger who else is to blame, other than it seems as if there's some level of collusion between parties in the organization and the parties who are making the bidding. So that bid rigging is very, very prevalent in my own respectful view. And also, Madam President, as we look forward, I also want us, in the discussion that will ensue, once the procurement regulator begins operating and the office is fully operational, the issue of when we look at how to treat with parties who have run afoul of the system, for want of a better phrase, that the part of the penalties we have to examine the issue of civil asset forfeiture. Because at the end of the day, people engage in these activities not for the money itself, or for what the money could buy. That at the end of the day, people want to have things that money can buy. And the issue of civil asset forfeiture is a discussion that I believe it's time that discussion begins, that is something that we really need to look at. So while we are within the arm of procurement, we have to understand that the reason why we are having challenges with procurement is because people are seeing the opportunity to enrich themselves, and in enriching themselves, they have things. And if they recognize that there's perhaps in the future someone's going to say, well, the government can take away those things. That is a discussion that I would like to be part of going forward. Madam President, when the committee met, as I indicated earlier, I think we had a very, very focused set of discussions. They were very, very intense at times. One of the issues that we discussed that took up a lot of time was the issue of the members being able to trade with the government. And I think that is something that is adequately treated with inside of the amendment, and it has my full support. I believe that when we looked at that, we recognized that was something that needed some tightening up, and the committee, with the support of the really excellent team from the CPC, I think that even someone like me, when we looked at it and I'm like, okay, I'm trying to understand really what it means, I think that the process was a process that allowed for a lot of clarity, and I am fully supportive of this particular measure. Madam President, unlike regarding the issue of the making of regulations by the Minister of Finance in relation to the remuneration, I see no bugs in there, Madam President. That is part of the normal way in which things work, and everyone is entitled to their opinion, and my opinion, Madam President, is that there's no devils inside of this. I believe this is a standard, relatively usual provision, and I don't see any issue, and it says the minister, but it's just the minister. At the end of the day, there has to be a party authorizing the expenditure of government monies, and that person just happens to be the minister. And so be it. So on that issue, Madam President, I have no objection whatsoever. Again, I believe this is a strong amendment and adds a lot of credibility to the bill. One of the other issues, Madam President, is the procedure for making regulations in relation to the disposal of state lands. Again, this was something that engaged a lot of discussion because it seemed to have slipped in the Parent Act. And I think that this particular amendment is critical because
I'm an energy person, and I understand that the Ministry of Energy at times would do what's called bidding rounds, both onshore and offshore, and would allow for the provision, the providing acreage under license to various parties. And if you're trying to suggest that giving someone a lease on acreage is not disposal, that really, that for me, I understood it better following the discussion, during the discussion, and with the support of the CPC team. And I believe that what we've done is plugged a major gap. We've plugged a major gap with this amendment, that it also says now, effectively, anything that's not covered under a specific piece of legislation, anything to do with the disposal of land, whether it's actually sale or lease, is actually captured here now by the Office of the Procurement Regulator. That will allow or stop, parties from making any creative or trying to be creative with state assets or state lands. Madam President, I want to go on. I'm trying to keep on time. The public procurement, however, Madam President, in Trinidad and Tobago continues, I believe, to abdicate part of its responsibility in supporting sustainable and inclusive growth while ensuring the most efficient use of funds. Madam President, I hope that with these amendments that have been proposed today and the full proclamation of the Act, that we will see an increase in the efficiency of public spending, facilitating in particular, in my view, the participation of small and medium-sized enterprises in public procurement, thus enabling this critical part of our economic system. Madam President, every economic system, the SMEs are the bedrock. Every system has large enterprises, but you need to try to have a system that encourages and supports the smaller and medium-sized enterprises, because they are the ones who actually have systems that allow for real employment generation, that allows for people who may not have all of the skills required to be able to get jobs. You have the big formal organization, there's a whole long process to be able to get into one of those places to get a job. The small and medium enterprises, you find they're much more flexible, and it has a very, very great impact on the economic system. And public procurement has a role in that. And I believe that because of the way in which it's evolved, you have, for some services in this country, there's probably one or two contractors. Everybody's just gotten very huge. And then the other smaller ones, you don't even hear about them. You don't even know about them. Madam President, transparent, fair, and competitive public procurement generates business opportunities, drives economic growth, and creates jobs. By rethinking the entire approach to purchasing, and what I would say is not an English word, but professionalizing the buying of services. So you bring in a professional element to the purchasing of services. As it is now, if you engage in the average ministry or department, you have somebody, an AO2 or somebody buying, looking at, it's not, while they're doing the job and they're doing the best that they could within the existing CTB rules, we're applying a level of professionalism to public buying. You can actually go and learn procurement as a unit. You can get a degree and a master's in procurement. It's a specific area of study. So that while all along we've gone along and we've done okay, but I believe that one of the critical things that this does is allows to have a level of professionalism in terms of how we approach the spending of government money for services. I believe it will end up cutting red tape. We will certainly benefit from what's called the digital revolution. E-procurement is something that I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot of. I believe it will lead to improved governance, simplification of procedures, and a greater use of electronic tools in public procurement. And Madam President, that point is important because as you start to use more and more electronic tools, you start to reduce the opportunity for the low-level types of corruption that we see in the country. Because as you automate a system, when you automate it, you get some other guys who become talented at finding ways to break your system. But at least the random, the type of the things that we are seeing in the system now, you eliminate the opportunity or significantly reduce the opportunity for those types of activities. Madam President, as the biggest single spender in the local economy, the state has the opportunity, and the public sector buying fraternity has the opportunity to use procurement strategically to drive horizontal policies such as those that aimed at creating more innovative, competitive, less corrupt, and creating a more, what I would call, a socially inclusive economy. Madam President, if I sound utopian with these last comments, I beg your indulgence, because I genuinely believe that we have the opportunity to fix the ills in this country. If I didn't believe that, Madam President, I would have been doing something else. Today, Madam President, I believe procurement in Trinidad and Tobago begins a new era. We may finally be getting the opportunity to take a big swing at that little thing called corruption. Of course, it is my personal, probably facetious belief that there's no such thing as corruption in Trinidad and Tobago. Why, you may ask? Because to date, no one has been charged, much less convicted, or ever spent a day at the luxurious accommodations at the Golden Grove prison. So do we wonder why things are the way we are? Madam President, every day I wake up and I give thanks to the Father, and I thank him for the ability to be able to see another day. I say that I'm thankful for my family, and I say that I will try to go and do the best that I can do on every given day. Madam President, at 1 Peter 3:16, I quote, it says, it goes, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. At Psalm 37:28, the Bible says, for the Lord loves the just. I will not forsake his faithful ones. Wrongdoers will be completely destroyed, and the offspring of the wicked will perish. Madam President, part of the job of the procurement body is to ensure that the resources of the state are being properly and efficiently managed by the respective custodians. The resources that the custodians manage do not belong to them. They must understand that they are custodians, and they must give full and unfettered accounting of all their actions in regards to those resources. Custodians shouldn't be given instructions about how to respond or how not to respond. Custodians have to do their job, understanding that they have a duty to account fully. And we have a challenge with that, Madam President. Custodians have to understand that they have to account. Madam President, the amendments proposed in this bill are intended to provide additional oversight, cut down on potential litigation, regulations for disposal of state lands. It allows for closing of a big loophole. And the terms and conditions for the positions, that's a normal procedure, and the minister has full say on that, and I have no challenge with that. Madam President, someone once told me that haters will see you walk on water, and they will say it's because you can't swim. Madam President, as I begin to wrap up, Madam President, you bottled the preacher in me. Madam President, as you should know, I'm a humble soul. I have one peeve. I try my best every day, Madam President, to do the right thing. That is what I try. I work hard, and I try to do the right thing. It is in me. I don't know how to do anything else. And that is why when I'm challenged on that, I take it really, really seriously. Madam President, permit me to digress. We in our country, we have a lot of negative news. I just want to say a word of thanks, Madam President, to the officers of the Central Police Station in Port-of-Spain. You may be aware, Madam President, a very close family member of mine required the attention of the police. And I wasn't there, but they went to the station last Friday, and they were given an appropriate response. They didn't call my name, just said they went there, they wanted to report this, wanted this dealt with, and they were treated with very courteous, professional, and listen, we all hear the negative stuff. And all I'm saying that, in between there's good stuff. Yes. Yeah, and we should probably give a little note on the good stuff. So forgive me for digressing on that, Madam President, because I believe while we're talking procurement, perhaps when I eventually got there, I think the procurement people probably need to help the guys with some furniture, new furniture and stuff. But, but I think we have to understand that Trinidad is a country where we have so many good things going on. And we're in a place where we're trying to fix one of the biggest and major problems that have affected this country for many, many years, public procurement. Public procurement has been allowed or has been perverted by the deliberate actions of many and several parties for the sole purpose of personal enrichment, removing food, literally removing food from the plates of the citizens of this country. And that has to stop, or it has to begin to stop. Madam President, I also want to share that the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs could tell you the last time he and I had a discussion, we're in a room, in the same room with heads of state and with the United States Secretary of State. John Kerry's in the room, and we're all in the same room, and the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs is right here. And we're in the same room. And Madam President, the opportunity to be in those rooms allows me to be able to share with people my views on matters, to hear their views. And when we talk about professionalism and talk about people having respect for you, that is where, to be in that room, you have to be invited. And I wasn't part of the government delegation, for the record, Madam President. I was on my own devices. And I share that, Madam President, because we're in a country where we often undervalue what we have. We have to understand that the state's resources have to be applied in a way that the citizens, the majority of the citizens, get the benefit of those state resources. And try to avoid a situation where you have a small group, or probably now it's a bigger group, seeming to be enjoying the fabulous life, living this wonderful life, and then you have people who are not. And I don't know how to put it else. They are not. They are struggling. Madam President, 2 days ago, I will share again. I'm in my regular supermarket. My neighbor he's here will tell you. We know. And every time I go and I see this happening, it's happening more and more. I am there with my basket of goods, Madam President, and a lady and a son and a daughter. They are there, and every item that the cashier cashes, she's looking to see the total. And when they cash the big bottle of oil, she's telling the boy to go back. And, you know, we don't understand how a lot of people are living on the edge. We are living on the edge. And then you have people taking state resources and enriching themselves. They're effectively taking food off the plate of the citizens of this country. So you see, this legislation begins to open a door for us to try to stop that and to allow for a more even spread of the state's resources so that those who really need it can have it. And, that pains me, Madam. It pains me. I'm there, I'm able to do what I have to do, but I recognize I see it more and more, and you have to be patient. Because in the line you want to go, but I'm like, you know, you have to be patient because people have a finite amount of money. And these things get to me because I recognize that, as I always say, I'm a normal person. I live in a normal, regular area. I interact with normal, regular people, and the people approach me, I want to talk, I talk with them. And life in Trinidad and Tobago could be a lot better if when we put this legislation into place and it is properly proclaimed and fully enacted and fully enforced, those who want to steal, and I'm using that, who want to steal from the public purse will have to understand that there's penalties for that, and that going through the procurement regulator and then the review board, you will be caught. You will be caught. And Madam President, as I close, I want to say that I fully support the amendments presented here today. I think the amendments are solid, they're strong, they improve on the parent legislation, but I'm also of the view that right now we need to get the parent legislation, everything fully proclaimed and going. I think that is where we are. I accept that there's parties submitted something that we may want to look at, but let's look at that down the road. Let's look at that down the road. My focus now is on supporting this and getting this passed, and once we get this passed and we start to put it in place, perhaps it could lead to a day when a citizen of this country could feel that perhaps public procurement is finally doing the job that it's supposed to do and serving all of the people of Trinidad and Tobago in the same way. Madam President, with those few words, I thank you.
Honourable Senators, at this time I think we'll take the tea break. So we will suspend and return at 5 p.m. So this sitting is now suspended until 5 p.m.